back to The Upgrade, the Hotel News Now EMEA podcast. It's great to have you with us. I'm Terence Baker, as always, HNN's news editor for Europe, Middle East and Africa, obviously. That's the region we're covering. As always, I'm ably assisted by producer Patrick Skillicorn. He's sitting by my left. Of course, you can't see that. In this month's edition of the podcast, we're going to look ahead. It's January 2025. Happy New Year to you all. What can we expect from the next 12 months? To seek answers, we're joined by Alex Robinson, Director of Industry Partners here at STR, parent company of HNN. And I'm sure, as you all know, we're both part of CoStar now. So, we've had a chat, we've looked down the telescope, the stars are aligned, we made for each other hot water bottles on this chilly day, and now we're ready to dive in. 5 key areas we've isolated, and who knows, maybe there'll be a 6th or 7th or 8th that will emerge during the next 20 minutes or so. So, the 5 areas. 1, business on the books. The year is looking good in Europe, but supply could be an issue. 2, group and MICE business, that is meetings, incentives, conventions and expositions. Will that be strong this year? Will leisure, number 3, will leisure still rule the roost, or is a post-COVID hangover about to start? 4, bifurcation, that was the buzzword of 2024, but will we still see it remaining and continuing across the next 365 days? And lastly, sustainability. Will the industry be sustainable and even wanting to talk about sustainability over the next 12 months? I assume the idea is to have that notion inextricably linked with profit, and why should it not be? So that's the agenda. Alex, welcome. In a week that you've seen your beloved Arsenal lose to Manchester United in the first round of anger in the FA Cup, it's actually the 3rd year in a row you've been knocked out of a 3rd round of the FA Cup. So we're wondering if your data that you're seeing is as consistent as Arsenal's failure. Tell me, what's been going on? What have you seen? What laggards are there in Europe in terms of destinations for this year?
Well, I think the good news for hotel performance, unlike football, is you're judged by a little bit more than your last result. So we're not just only going to focus on what happened last month, but looking at the longer term trends. I think if you talk about laggards across Europe, you'd have to talk about DACH, Central and Eastern Europe. While the Mediterranean was doing incredibly well with so much international travel, high-spending luxury guests, we didn't see the immediate return of international travel to Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Central and Eastern Europe. However, yesterday's laggard is today's gain. So what we've seen in terms of occupancy throughout 24 has been really positive. Both of those respective regions growing occupancy 4%, ahead of the European average at 2%. And there's everything to say that will take shape this year. Though I don't think we can make any illusion that not having the European Football Championships in Germany will be a bit of hangover, particularly for those more tertiary markets, your Leipzig, your Dortmund, that had a huge boost that we saw from the games. But even if we had the Euros again this summer, I think England would probably still pull up in second.
We would lose on penalties at some point, and producer Patrick and we support teams that generally do much worse than Arsenal across the season, so we're not much to brag about. In Germany, Alex, are we still seeing a bit of hangover from COVID? I mean, it was late to the game of returning, wasn't it, Germany? I mean, or are they getting their trade shows back? Are they getting events? What's happening in Germany?
Well, I think a second part of that hangover, the first one we mentioned, the return of international travel, but also we've seen this to an extent with group as well, is that you can't go ahead and pitch up these huge events overnight. COVID takes 2 years out of the calendar. It takes quite a while to bring those back. But we have seen those to great success. If you think about some of the big trade fairs, Drupa in Frankfurt, for example, RevPAR performance, 264% increase during the event itself, staggering. And I think another piece of good news there is it still actually didn't reach the levels that it saw in 2016. So even though events are back, still a bit of room to grow. And we also saw the same again if you're looking to Automechanica in Frankfurt, where RevPAR was up about 170%. So I think we won't have the Taylor Swift Eras Tour. We won't have all of the football championships, but some of those big Weltmesses are particularly coming back. And I know we'll touch on it later as well in terms of supply. That can be a really nice tailwind.
Well, let's switch on that now. Let's talk about supply. There's a few rumours that it could be a bit frothy in 2025. What do you see?
It's a real mix, which is interesting. If we were having this podcast back in 2018-19, so much of what we talk about would be new supply. But as we all know, interest rates changed, the financing environment's changed, brands are focused on conversions, which won't have as much of an impact on net supply because you effectively be shifting rooms between the brands. But if you talk about the usual suspects where we are going to see a lot of supply increase, London, Dublin, Hamburg, Frankfurt, and those are markets that I'd say are well accustomed to having large amounts of supply. One call out that I think that's interesting to see is Dublin, where we're actually forecasting occupancy down as much as potentially 2%, and that's really all supply driven, with supply as much as 5%. But London, on the other hand, which has been weathering new supply year after year, we're still going to see occupancy forecasted for growth of around 1%, even with supply slated to increase as much as 3.6%. I thought it was also interesting to call out as well. I don't know if you saw an article in the FT talking about luxury supply. We know that luxury has been so successful, we can touch on bifurcation. So luxury supply actually making luxury occupancy in London muted thereabouts for this year, whereas the city itself is still slated to grow.
London is always going to be a very top market, isn't it? We'll get to bifurcation in a minute, Alex. Let's talk about leisure. We have an inauguration of a new president of the United States, or a new old president of the United States. Usually does very well on economics. Will that see a lot more Americans coming over to Europe? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of leisure? Because that's what really has fueled our industry over the last 4 or 5 years.
And you certainly see that. Interesting article from British Airways today talking about record performance in transatlantic travel, which was their big bet. You hear about the American carriers that are adding more and more seat capacity across the Atlantic. Interestingly, too, actually, the US sending more people abroad in terms of US travelers than we would do Europeans at this time. So I think there's a lot to be said that will continue. That being said, if you went to Rome last year, are you going to do an Italian tour again? What's the appetite for US travelers to continue to returning? But I think the real positive we have in Europe is there's so much to see in terms of cultural variance, and Americans, especially the more affluent ones who can pay for those upscale branded room nights, are going to continue to return. So I think on the whole, at the upper end of the spectrum for luxury, you can still see strong performance, but we are seeing that. We saw that in the US domestically. We see that in Europe domestically, as well as the economy end of the travel. That's where you're going to see a bit more of a challenge. But I think your affluent jet setter type, if you will, to use that moniker, is going to be continuing to make those trips.
I mean, there are 400 million Americans, maybe a few more if they absorb Canada. I mean, what are you seeing also in terms of China? I mean, we keep talking about China coming back. We keep talking about perhaps the travel Chinese would do will morph a little bit. It won't be the groups, it'll be more individuals. I mean, what are you seeing out of China?
I think on the group front, it's interesting. Group across Europe still about 20% off of the watermark of 2019. I think the Chinese traveler certainly play a part in that. Also with the change to VAT legislation as well, you think about before, those shoppers being able to claim back VAT on their way out of the UK, that certainly pushed some of the Chinese travel away. But also, I think broadly speaking, it's a longer tail traveler. It's taken a while to come back. So we're, based on data from our friends at Tourism Economics, we're seeing that around the end of 26 is when we'd see the full recovery of Chinese traveler to Europe. And I think that's really pinpointed in certain markets, maybe as much as a percentage point of occupancy, which is a lot and also isn't a lot depending on what you're looking at again. But if you're talking about a more affluent traveler going to your Santorini for that photo that everyone is so craving to get, then I think that will still take place. But we can't ignore the headlines of the Chinese economy at home, just like we can't ignore the headlines of the US and European economies as well. That will ultimately filter down. But I think Chinese travel still still working its way back and not to the levels that we would have seen before.
I mean, everyone's hoping it will. They're kind of putting in place menu items, etc. We'll see when it comes. Let's talk about hotels and events. You mentioned it a little while ago. Some of the A-list events we had in 2024. I mean, what a year that was for events. It simply won't be the same amount this year. Oasis can't do it. They're just basically playing United Kingdom and a few dates in Ireland. What are you seeing in terms of events, or is it just a year for leisure travellers to take those rooms?
Well, I still think you'll see. The good news is that if you look out at future occupancies, even for events that are happening in September, if you think about a more near-term event, Mobile World Congress in Barcelona every year, huge spike in terms of business on the books there. So we know that demand can be driven on those compression nights, but you're right, we can't replace the Olympics. We can't replace Taylor Swift Eras Tour, Adele in Munich. We can't. Oasis, be it as you may for your taste of music, they can't necessarily supplant all of those. The good news being, though, is that where events created big boosts of compression, if you look at the Olympics, Paris occupancy itself was actually down around 2 percentage points throughout 2024 because of all the displacement leading up to the games and afterwards. So where there were big events, you are going to be able to see that, especially in those bigger metropolitan markets. So, Munich, Berlin, markets that have that compression. I think the challenge you'll see trying to replicate those is Taylor Swift going to play in Warsaw again? Warsaw, not as dynamic an international market as a Munich, as a London, as a Paris. So I think those are the markets where you'll feel it more acutely, where you're not going to have something to move the needle to that extent.
So we'll call them secondary cities, but obviously big events in those cities obviously moves the needle a bit more. We talked bifurcation. We mentioned that word a couple of times already. The inexorable rise of luxury and budget to a certain degree. What are the macroeconomic issues at play for that now? And do you see those two segments continuing to take the lion's share of interest from investors and travellers?
I think what was interesting story throughout COVID was that bookend of performance where you've got luxury winning on rate, economy winning on occupancy. Last year was actually good news for the middle as well. So upscale, upper mid-scale hotels also doing well. And I think that lends itself to an interesting dynamic where you'll have travelers. Maybe you go somewhere for business, you stay in an upscale hotel if you're fortunate to, then you stay the weekend with your family in a mid-scale hotel. So I think that blending between the classes, but I think there's no lying. If you think about some of the macroeconomic data, economy, think about credit cards. I think I read in a recent article in the US since 2010, highest number of credit card delinquencies. And to me, that's an indication of people. It was great to receive those government monies during the time of COVID, pent up, maybe spent up, and we're not going to see that same pricing power at the economy end of the spectrum. So I think if you're in the upscale lifestyle, if you will, to luxury, things can continue to go well. Middle of the spectrum can do well for corporate and also those trading between. But I do think it will be more challenging for those at the lower end if you look at the wider economic data. If you think about in the UK as well, mortgage rates maybe not as acutely felt as they were 6 months ago, but still people aren't going to be getting rates of 2%. You're going to be getting closer to 4 or 5, and ultimately that's going to make its way into disposable income. So
you mentioned the mid-scale segments, the legacy hotels, if you will, of a lot of the brands that have been around forever. Are they getting business because people playing down the segment, they're spending a little bit less on their accommodation? Or where do you see that demand coming from?
I think it's quite interesting there if you go across demographics and you look maybe to baby boomers who you'd associate more with a full-scale hotel, high emphasis on traditional breakfast, amenities within, whereas perhaps a younger traveler where it's about a room in the city and the city is an extension of the room versus the room itself. So I think all of those come into play, but you've also, not to name check too many brands, but you've got some brands who are very adept at a really good standard of quality that when you check into the room that it's not upscale or luxury, but it's to a really high caliber of performance that you can actually get for a reasonable rate. So I also think that plays into it as well, as people being able to, maybe they're not going to spend £500 on a room, but you can still get an excellent room in some cities for Yeah, much less than that, unless you leave it too late, like I did in Madrid, and stay in an interior core-facing windowless room with a 1-year-old. But I think that's just a bit of last-minute travel gone wrong.
You won't be able to do that soon in Barcelona, talking about
That's true,
Spain.
yeah.
2028, I believe they're going to ban all Airbnb-style rentals. I'll be moderating a panel very soon on over-tourism at the Atlantic Ocean Hotel Investors Summit in Madrid. You mentioned Madrid. And we'll be very interested to see how they look at the economics of over-tourism in terms of hotel performance and operations and profit and loss. That'd be very interesting. You talk about credit cards and maybe corporate mortgage-backed securities in the States, having a little bit of pressure placed on them. What other macroeconomic issues do you see really affecting the hotel industry in the next 12 months? Is it just lack of cost of living? That's a big thing here in the United Kingdom.
I also think in terms of the political element, we've also seen hotels in terms of an asset class versus office versus retail. If you're an institutional or fund investor, whatever your capital may be looking to be deployed towards, hotels are increasingly attractive. So even if we may have some of those macroeconomic headwinds on the horizon, like you say, hotels and the long-term fundamentals. And one trend that I always like to call out is if you look at UK GDP going back to the turn of the millennium, the correlation between demand, room nights sold. So you think about after September 11th, where we thought airline travel is going to be irrevocably changed, still selling more rooms, the dot-com bubble around that same time, global financial crisis, advent of Airbnb, geopolitical uncertainty. All the while, we're still selling more rooms. But one component I do think that will be interesting to see is those geopolitical concerns that we have at the moment. And it is uncertainty is the new normality that we live within. But if we were able to, certainly for a human's sake, but also what that could mean to the economy, end both of the conflicts in Ukraine as well as in Israel, or have a ceasefire to those, the boom that could mean for confidence, for spending and travel, I think would be huge. But yeah, I think many more important reasons to see those to an end. But I think those are two potential tailwinds if it could be done.
I'm not so sure if uncertainty hasn't always been around. I mean, one of the benefits, or maybe it's not a benefit of age, is that you see a few cycles going round and round, and who knows if it's any better now than it used to be. But one thing I think has changed, and you'll probably agree with this, is that travel is now a human right almost, and people are still squirreling away money to take their families away or to go on a trip on their own, etc., etc. I mean, I don't see that going away. Do you?
No, I completely agree. And I think that's one of the reasons that I ended up in this industry, I believe, is I think travel is a force for change, is a force for experience. So I think many people, rather than have XYZ car or XYZ material possession, to be able to go with your grandparents to the place that your family originated from, or to be able to take your son or daughter to a place that you cherished as a kid. I think people truly realize the value of that over others. I mean, you yourself, how many countries are on your list now? You've got perhaps Terry's other alias is the most interesting man in the world, which I think is duly fitting. But how many countries are you on at the minute?
Around 107. Yeah. I haven't counted.
And your most favorite obscure one, do you think? Because I mean, you haven't been to Tristan da Cunha yet, but I suppose you probably.
Tristan da Cunha. No, Myanmar probably, just because it closed so quickly afterwards. So you mentioned some of the hints of sustainability. As more people travel, as more people see it as a human right, if you will, as an onus on the hotel companies to have that sustainable track record. As I said, I'm looking at over-tourism as a subject now. And I really wonder if those issues are at the fundamental heart of hotel firm strategies, or whether they'll just have to do them if there's enough weight behind the industry coming from governments, perhaps the guest, and they're forced to do it. Carrot and stick. I think sustainability over tourism, it's for stick. It's not for carrot. I mean, how do you see that? I mean, what are you looking at in sustainability? I mean, every year it's mentioned. Every year, I'm not sure much is done. Absolutely demanding clear guidelines so that we all can do the same thing rather than individually coming up with bunch of nebulous guidelines that may work and may not work over a long time. How do you see sustainability playing out meaningfully?
Well, I agree. It has to be aligned with policy and has to be one that's enacted. And some good news last year with the release of USALI's 12th edition and really highlighting energy, water, and waste, not just bundling those into utilities, but really calling them out. What's your energy utilization? What's your water? What's your waste? To really pay them homage. Also talking about renewable energy, compost as well. I think Greenview, looking at their most recent lodging trends report, they've got over 20,000 hotels that they're pursuing benchmarking sustainability with globally. And I think their findings are really interesting in some of the surveys that they put forth to their sample base, talking about energy efficiency. 77% of the hotels in their sample have a plan for energy usage, so it's something that they're keenly aware of. I think more importantly to call out too, so if you talk about the hotels that are in the most efficient quartile for energy usage versus the ones that are in the lower, they can perform as much as 3 times better. So if we've got policy on the one hand where we know it needs to come, it needs to be enacted for some, those that are being more proactive are having tangible benefits. If you're 3 times as energy efficient, ultimately that's going to come down to the bottom line. If we
and that will attract additional investment, presumably.
And you're already seeing that with green financing as well. You see banks offering a plethora of different green financing options. But it was interestingly speaking to a hotelier in London recently, old asset, and actually when they did the math due to the green incentive, putting in water pump through the ground versus the traditional boiler, actually in the end made more financial sense. So it wasn't just about them feeling like they're making the right environmental step. It was incentivized by the financing they received. So I think as we move closer and closer, there's going to be more development, as you say, because we can't end up standing at every conference paying lip service to it and not actually delivering tangible results, which I think that's why what Greenview has in their trends report and the work they do is so interesting, because it's tangible. You can see, you can benchmark, and you can take away the performance difference.
And a certain amount of capital just won't be interested unless you have these guidelines and benchmarks in place. I always think of Germany and Austria as perhaps being a little bit farther ahead of other people.
But Denmark and the Nordics as well.
Nordics, of course, slightly different market, isn't it? It's a very insular one. If I can put you on the spot, Alex, you've given us some great information. What 1 or 2 trends do you see really being pushed this year in terms of the hotel industry in Europe?
Great question. I think ultimately demand, probably one that we don't talk about a lot, because ultimately we talk about occupancy, we talk about rate and RevPAR, but demand on the whole still positive. If you look at it on a global level, growing 2% or 3% on month, Europe slightly ahead of that. So while we ultimately will look at those KPIs, let's not lose sight of the fact that even with everything that's transpiring, we're still selling more rooms as an industry. And I think that's really important to take hold. In terms of a second point, I would say getting back to the fundamentals of supply and demand. We looked at supply. That is actually quite a nice tailwind for many markets. We talked about the Dublins and the Londons that are used to having those high levels of supply, but we also have, due to some of the financing constraints, not as an intensified supply landscape as we would have seen in years past. So that can certainly be a nice tailwind for us. So I think those two, looking at the fundamentals of supply and demand, maybe not the big lightning headlines that we like to see, but the fundamentals within the industry. And we should never, ever take for granted that we continue to sell more and more rooms year after year. I think that's a really privileged position, and also ties back into what you're saying is people prizing travel as a force for good and force for experience.
There's reasons to be positive. We are a positive industry. When we go to conferences, it's always quite positive. People talk about headwinds, of course. But yeah, thank you, Alex. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope the listeners saw a few trends they can kind of hook onto for the upcoming 12 months. What else has been in H&N's pages in the last month? We had a great interview with Gilda Perez Alvarado, who's both the Chief Strategy Officer at Accor and also the CEO of Orient Express. hotels, yachts, trains, bringing back the golden age of travel. There's some very exciting things happening under that brand, not at a small price point, I imagine, but it's wonderful for the industry. In terms of big numbers, a hotel in the Canary Islands sold for 110 million euros. The La Branda Suites Costa Adeje in Tenerife in the Canary Islands. That was sold by Atom Hoteles, so that was a big deal. We've also seen Minor International, Thai company, not in the EMEA region, but they proposed to delist NH hotels, NH hotels back in the day. It's called NH now. And of course, I think that's now, they changed it now because Chinese money in there, but they're going to delist that big hotel block in Europe, 357 hotels, I believe, in 38 countries. Officially became Minor Hotels Europe and Americas, a bit more of a potentially bland name, but there you go, that happened. And also we saw connection with Accor, the investor in the Orient Express trains and yachts is French giant LVMH, Moet Hennessy Louis Vuitton. They also made another foray into the hotel industry with a minority stake in another French company, Les Demands de Fontenelle. I probably pronounced that hideously wrong. Excuse me to my French listeners. And a wonderful bunch of hotels in France, very lifestyle, boutique-y, and in absolutely wonderful, wonderful places. So that's some of the stories that will be going on in H&N. As always, every other Thursday, Hotel News Now publishes an EMEA newsletter with exclusive articles, opinion, news and comments. You know the drill. Go to hotelnewsnow.com, sign up, scroll down the left-hand side of the page, double-click, and fill in a sign-up sheet next to a photo of Berlin Cathedral. Maybe one day I'll change that photo, but at the moment it's Berlin Cathedral. So, all that's left for me is to say thank you for listening, and I hope you'll tune in next time. This is The Upgrade, for Hotel News Now EMEA podcast. It was produced by Patrick Skillicorn, and additional material and lots of data was provided by STR's William Anns, and this month, STR's Alex Robinson.
Hi, I'm STR's Isaac Collazo.
And I'm co-star Jan Freitag, and together we are the data geeks behind Tell Me More, a hospitality data podcast on the Hotel News Now podcast network.
Every month, we bring you a fresh take on the latest hotel data, insight into the travel trends behind that performance, and the big picture topics you should be thinking about.
And we don't mind getting into good-natured disagreements from time to time. Hey, when Isaac and I start talking about data together, anything can happen, and it usually does.
Find us on hotelnewsnow.com and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you like to listen. Search for Hotel News Now, and thank you for listening.